Hi guys, I'm back again today with another video, and today we're checking out why Indonesia is quietly becoming Asia's next superpower. Ooh, this is interesting. I'm intrigued to see. So let's get it.
When you think of Asia's most successful economies, countries like
Like
Singapore,
Singapore.
South Korea, and Japan
Mm,
probably come to mind. But it's actually a different Asian country that's becoming a symbol of economic success, that has been growing faster and becoming larger than any of them, and
what's
that's
this issue?
quickly establishing itself as a major technological hub. And at the same time, it's a country that you don't really ever hear about Indonesia. Indonesia's economy is now 10 times bigger than it was just 2 decades ago. After 20 years of frantic economic growth, it has been overtaking major Western economies in size one after another. But still, its rise has so far gone mostly unnoticed. But ignoring Indonesia would be a huge mistake, because hidden away from attention and front page news, it's
They were like,
quietly
oh,
transforming itself
Monas.
into Asia's third giant, the third and last economic superpower of the region, after China and India, that will soon become impossible to ignore any longer. So,
Oh.
this is the rise of Indonesia. But to understand how much Indonesia has grown, we need to understand where it started from. Because just 20 years ago, Indonesia was in a very much the opposite situation as today. At the beginning of the century, it was a country with an economy that was falling apart. Skyrocketing inflation, collapsing currency, and political instability so bad that no one would dare to bet on the country's future success. So, what happened? In the 20th century, Indonesia was never really an especially economically successful country in any stretch of imagination. After gaining its full independence in 1949 until the late 1960s, Indonesia was going through a long period of economic chaos and political instability. Going from a liberal democracy to a managed democracy to finally a military dictatorship, it was experiencing 1,000% annual inflation, shrinking export, crumbling infrastructure, and minimal foreign investment. Finally, in the 1970s, the situation started to get better. Under the
Mm.
military dictator, Indonesia started to mass export crude oil, and thanks to a rise in oil prices at the time, it experienced its first period of proper economic growth. Using the oil revenue, it invested in infrastructure and building other sectors of the
He's on
economy,
a
and it
roller
became a
skate.
major
Nice.
manufacturer of everything from clothes to furniture. And for a while, things were looking good. But by the end of the century, most of Asia was hit by the Asian financial crisis, and Indonesia was hit harder than any other country. Within just a few months, the economy suddenly collapsed, and it went from a hopeful success story to a sick man of the region. In 1998, its economy contracted by nearly 14%. Inflation reached 65%, and the Indonesian currency lost 70% of its value. The economic damage was so big that it led to a downfall of Indonesia's dictator and a chaotic transition towards democracy. And while the rest of Asia recovered relatively quickly from the crisis, and the region was soon growing again, in the early 2000s, Indonesia was still in chaos, trying to establish new democratic institutions, dealing with the remnants of the previous regime, and trying to at least stabilize the economy. Its previous growth now long forgotten. As the World Bank has claimed at the time, no country in recent history, let alone one the size of Indonesia, has ever suffered such a dramatic reversal of fortune. In other words, if you had to pick one country in the region on which you shouldn't bet on, Indonesia would seem like a pretty smart
But
choice. But
you
just
wish
20
it.
years later, the situation turned out to be completely different, and actually the complete opposite. In 2024, Indonesia's GDP is estimated to reach almost $1.5 trillion. That's roughly 15 times bigger than at its low point in 1998, and 6 times bigger than just 20 years ago. And while back then it was the 37th largest economy, today it's the 16th
Whoa.
largest in the world.
Whoa.
So,
Whoa. Whoa. That is crazy. 16th. What? Amazing. Amazing. That is so beautiful. And if Indonesia can do it, we can do it. But it's gonna take a leader who's not corrupt. I cannot talk on this topic or else.
how did they do it? Basically, the Indonesian growth story can be split into two different decades, in which the growth has been driven by different factors. And once one growth engine has been exhausted, the country has managed to find a new one to replace it with. In the first period of roughly 2004 to 2014, its growth has been mainly driven by its commodity export. Indonesia is one of the most resource-rich countries, and so it exports everything from oil, gas, and coal to coffee, rice, and rubber. From 2004 on, the world has seen a major rise of commodity prices, and so its economy was able to quickly grow. But so far, that's not really anything special. Other resource-rich emerging economies saw rapid growth at the same time. But the problem is that this only works for a while, and when the prices drop, the growth evaporates pretty quickly, which is exactly what happened to countries like Brazil in the 2010s, when commodity prices collapsed, and Indonesia was widely expected to follow the same fate. But that never happened. Unlike other countries, Indonesia's growth has only accelerated. So what happened? Well, unlike Brazil, for example, Indonesia was able to use the revenue from its resources and the periods of growth to build other industries and other sectors. And in the past decade and a half, it focused.
It makes sense. Like, that's how it should be. But, like some countries, um, the economy starts getting better, they start figuring things out, but then it goes straight into people's pockets. And you're like, oh, what happened? Right? If they actually use it to other sects and then drive capital or revenue from those, then probably we will see ourselves in the top even 50 uh GDPs that are growing, or economies I should say, yeah, GDP, economy, whatever, that are growing. But I don't know where we are gonna find ourselves in that list. To be honest, we probably are in, like, if not 100th, we're somewhere like 100 something, probably. Or maybe less. I don't know. Do not ask me.
On transforming its economy and moving away from just relying on resources. A good example of this is the industry that the country is building around nickel, a metal that's used in a number of industries, but most importantly in building batteries. And so it's absolutely essential for the electrical cars industry and for the wider shift towards green energy that the world is going through. And Indonesia is in the lucky situation of having the largest supplies of nickel in the world, and it's producing more of it than all other countries combined. Now, what most countries do, and what Indonesia traditionally used to do as well, is to sell raw nickel to other countries that then do the processing and use it to make batteries. That's how most resource-rich countries use what they have. But the problem with that is that although you do make money from selling the raw stuff, you don't make as much. And although it creates jobs, they tend to be more manual labor type jobs. So if you just keep selling it, you will always be a low-income economy. And so, Indonesia took a very unusual decision and decided to ban all of its nickel export, so that instead of just exporting the raw ore, it would build an entire processing and battery making industries
Smart.
around it. And so that by only exporting finished products,
More jobs for the citizens of Indonesia. You're creating jobs for the people, right? And you are the ones who are making it, so they have to come to you, and you're not going to give them the raw product. It's like, what do you want with the nickel? We will do it for you. uh right. So smart. Oh my gosh.
it would become irreplaceable for the entire EV industry and maximize the value it can get out of it. Now, this might sound obvious, but it's not how most countries treat their resources, and it's quite a unique thing to do, which is also why Indonesia has faced a lot of criticism, especially from the European Union for doing this, as the rich countries in the EU would much rather just keep buying the cheap ore and keep the processing industries for themselves. But it goes way beyond just mining and resources. Because another major industry that Indonesia has developed and that's driving the economy today is the digital economy, and specifically e-commerce and fintech. Today, Indonesia is something of an e-commerce giant in Southeast Asia. It has the largest e-commerce industry in the region, and the sector in the country is 6 times larger than in the Philippines, for example, even though Indonesian population is only twice as large. And that's not a coincidence, but actually another example of quite smart policies. Unlike in other countries that export a lot of oil and resources, where the money goes only towards a tiny percentage of individuals, the economic growth in Indonesia has been quite evenly distributed. And as a result, the country has grown a particularly strong and large middle class. And because the government invested quite a lot into infrastructure, Indonesia has a good internet coverage, even in rural areas. Together with a large domestic
No,
population,
I have
that
to move to
represents a
Indonesia.
perfect market for e-commerce companies and others that develop tech solutions around them. And as a result, Indonesia now has a number of large tech companies that are now expanding into the rest of South Asia. And on the back of an e-commerce sector, it is managing to build a strong startup ecosystem as well, producing 15 startups with over $1 billion valuations, more than any other Southeast Asian country except Singapore. And it's quickly becoming known as the regional startup and tech powerhouse. And this trend should only keep accelerating. According to McKinsey, Indonesia should become the 7th largest economy by 2030 and overtake the UK and Germany. And according to Goldman
What?
Sachs, it should become the 4th largest economy after the United States, China, and India by 2050. And unlike countries like China, it will have a major demographic benefit, as by then its growing population will mostly consist of young people in the productive age. And along with a population and economy of this size, naturally comes a growing geopolitical importance, especially with Indonesia's strategic location in a region that is seeing growing tension between China, Taiwan, the US, and its allies. But so far, rather than joining either side, Indonesia seems to be committed to carve its own path, balance between Beijing and Washington,
That's
and
so
maintain
good.
good relations with both, all the while increasing its own influence. And so it's buying weapons from the US, but building deeper economic ties with China, taking part in military exercises with Japan and America, but refusing to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In doing so, it's continuing its own tradition of non-alignment, trying to
Oh
become
my god, that's so smart. That's so smart because we are doomed over here because we are so like hopeful that US will have our back. Do you think US has our back? To be honest, they're just exploiting our resources and our manpower, but I don't think that we can rely solely on alliance without building our own. We are so reliant on alliances that when it comes to machineries, fleets, manpower, we are doom and gloom, to be honest. So if something happens, knock on wood, yeah, bye bye Philippines, I think. To be honest, sadly. I hope we are okay though, but we need to learn from Indonesia. You are literally next door neighbors. Why are we not learning from you guys? Why are we just sitting there like, oh, you know what? America got our back. No one, nobody has your back, only yourself. At the end of the day, when it comes to, if worse comes to worse, knock on wood, nobody has your back. Only you got your back. So, Indonesia's so smart. Why can't we not have people in power from Indonesia? Is that? Can we make that a thingy? Like, can we adopt the president of Indonesia? Just bring him here. Can we? Oh, you know how schools have exchange students? Can we have exchange presidents like once in a blue moon, like once a year? But then it's too bad for you guys though, because your economy is gonna be fudged. But you can exchange students or like let's make that a thing, right? So we can learn from each other, maybe. Um, so smart. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna use my alliances and learn from them, but I'm not going to 100% rely on them and just sit there and sit pretty. No, what are we doing? I'm moving to Indonesia.
In doing so, it's continuing its own
I'm
tradition of
moving.
non alignment, trying to become a third neutral power. And if it's able to do that, it might hugely benefit from being friends with everyone in an increasingly polarized world. So, is there anything that could threaten this rise to power? Well, in order to keep the growth at this or even a faster pace, the country has to do a lot. It has to improve its bureaucracy, education, infrastructure, and rule of law so that it's able to attract and build more high value businesses. And whether it's able to do that is unclear. But perhaps the biggest threat to its plans for success might actually be the same thing that plays into its favor: geopolitics. Because actually staying neutral and being friends with everyone might turn out to be a lot more difficult than it seems. Indonesia is already caught between military buildups by China on one hand and the United States on the other one. To the north, China is trying to dominate the South China Sea, and to the south, the United States have been increasing the alliance with Australia and building up its military presence there. And while Indonesia tries to remain non-aligned, it's gonna get harder and harder. China might force Indonesia to choose sides and either stand with China or face the consequences. And since China is its largest trading partner and losing the Chinese market would be a huge blow to their economy, it might be hard to refuse. But at the same time, Indonesia doesn't want to be too close to China either, as the two countries are in a dispute over parts of their regional waters, and 80% of Indonesians consider China to be a threat. And so, as the tensions in the region continue to heat up, Indonesia's non alignment might become increasingly difficult to maintain, with neutrality no longer an option, and it might have to end up choosing sides after all.
Ooh, well, they have to weigh the pros and cons of either. I mean, I feel like we have the same problem that we're facing on that the China part. But let's not talk about that. Well, at least you're it's looking optimistic. It's looking like they're taking steps towards something at least, right? So that's good. That's the only problem is the being neutral. But then I feel like for now it's the best thing until it's not, right? So the tactics that you're doing of being neutral is okay right now because they don't have to choose sides. It's not something that they're forced to do right now. But when it comes to it, then I feel like, okay, that's we will figure it out, right, when we get there. Or maybe they are working behind the scene to kind of like come up with a strategy of if something like this happens, what are we gonna do? I do believe that's something that Indonesia will be thinking about for sure. But anyways, beautiful people, this has been an interesting topic. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments, and I will see you in the next upload. Bye.